Welcome to Off the Record News. I'm your host, Diana Longrie. Thank you for tuning in. Off the Record News is brought to you live from the SCC studios out of White Bear Lake. And through a cooperative agreement, this program is also simultaneously broadcast live to those studios out of the Roseville viewing area, the CTV studios. As a result of this cooperative effort, this program reaches out to and serves approximately 28 communities in the Northeast metropolitan area. Now, this evening is May 1st, 2013. As I mentioned, it's a live program, so I encourage you to call in with any questions or comments that you may have for either myself or my guest this evening. And we do rebroadcast at other dates and times, so unfortunately, if you find yourself watching this during one of our broadcasts when it's not May 1st, well, you won't be able to call in, but I encourage you that if you would like to ask some questions, get a hold of me on Facebook. I'm on Facebook 24/7. Now, this evening, I think you're going to find our program very informative, enlightening, and maybe a little unsettling. Recently, there was an article in the city pages. And some of you may not have had an opportunity to see the article, but this was in the April 24th edition of City Pages, and it was entitled, "Thieves Bazaar. Hospitals, doctors, dealers have made Medicare the nation's sweetest crime. The feds are now trying to shutter the door." And there's quite a large article in here about the Medicaid fraud in Minnesota. And they specifically talk and have quotes from David Feinwachs, who is my guest this evening. So I am very pleased to have him here in person to be able to talk about this issue, particularly in Minnesota. So with that, I want to thank you, David, for being on the program this evening.
Well, thank you for asking me. It's my pleasure.
Yes. Now, our viewers, because they probably didn't have a chance to read the City Pages article, and don't know who you are, why don't you introduce yourself to our viewers?
Well, I was for approximately 30 years the general counsel, the chief legal counsel for the Minnesota Hospital Association, which is the trade association for all the hospitals in the state of Minnesota. And in 2010, as part of my job, I was instructed to look into issues of lack of transparency and accountability in our state Medicaid program. In plain English, to try to figure out where the money goes, because there's a lot of money spent on this program, and most healthcare providers feel that they're not seeing any of it, and our infrastructure is crumbling and patients are having difficulty getting access. So I started doing that, and that has led me to being here this evening and brought me through sort of a long and tortured journey in answering some of the questions about this program, which are many.
And you know, many of the people that I speak to, you know, they see the value in having Medicaid program available for people who need it, and that as long as the money is spent well and there's accountability, that they support the efforts of the program. But as I think that you're going to be talking more about, the issue of lack of accountability and the issue of, well, maybe the money not going for patient care, those are big issues that I think that certainly taxpayers and citizens will be very concerned about.
Yeah. The Medicaid program is a fantastic program. It provides access to health care for people who need it in this state and in most states. It's a program that's, in theory, half funded by the state, Minnesota, and half funded by the federal government. The problem we've had in Minnesota is that some years ago we outsourced this program to our HMOs, for not-for-profit health plans, or HMOs. And when we did that, we lost control of this program. We no longer have any idea how this program works. We don't know where the money goes. And of course, more recently, with the Affordable Care Act, many, many more Americans will now be receiving their health care through the expansion of the program that we call Medicaid. It's becoming more and more mainstream every day, with many more people becoming enrolled in it. And so understanding how it works and knowing where the money goes, and if the money goes for the purpose, becomes even more critically important. It also becomes critically important for everybody watching this program because as taxpayers, you're footing the bill for this. You're paying for it both in your state tax bill, your property tax bill, and your federal income tax bill. So make no mistake about it, you are the stockholders in this effort. It's all your money. You have every right to know where it goes, and if it's being diverted, you should be angry about that. You should be angry about it because 1, your money's not going where it's supposed to go. 2, you're paying more money than you need to pay. And 3, people that you think you're trying to take care of aren't receiving the care that you would hope that they would get. And so all of this is coming out of your pocket, and if you don't like what you hear this evening, you should in fact be outraged, and that's why we're going to talk about it.
And some of our viewers may say, you know, I just heard him say that the administration of this program has been outsourced to the HMOs. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. In the old days, the state of Minnesota ran the Medicaid program for the people who needed access to health care. They signed contracts with medical providers, doctors, hospitals, dentists, physical therapists, chiropractors. People received medical services. The state of Minnesota paid the bills. There were negotiated rates. There were rates established, and they ran the program. Probably 20 years ago, somebody thought it would be a good idea to give this to HMOs because, of course, managed care sounds attractive. I mean, somebody's going to manage the care. Well, we did this, and we lost all control over this program. We lost information about this program. We lost oversight about this program. We lost any idea of where and if the money goes. And this has become a big, big problem. For me, going back to 2010, when I started looking at this, the first thing I noticed is that these HMOs who are involved in running these programs, they appear to make all of their money from running these programs. They make more money running these programs than they make selling health insurance. And that's problematic, because health insurance is sold to healthy working people, and you would think that that would be a more profitable activity than running what used to be called welfare programs for the state. But it's not. They make 4 to 5 times more money doing that, according to the numbers that they report. And so I began asking questions why this was occurring, how this could occur, how could it be more profitable. I also asked questions about what kind of data, what kind of information the state has now that they've outsourced these programs. The more questions I asked, the tenser the environment got. And the long and the short of it is I began asking the questions in early 2010, January and February, and by November 2010, I'd lost my job. Along the way, I'd made a video which was posted on the internet, which asked some of these questions and explained how this lack of oversight was occurring, and explained to the best of our information at the time how these programs might be working. And this video was actually viewed by several thousand people. Boring as it might have been, it was a half-hour video that attempted to explain the functioning of a relatively complex program. But that video drew some attention to these issues, and after that, things started to happen.
And one of the, one thing that I'm thinking of when I'm listening to you, and you're talking about how the management of the program was outsourced to the HMOs, and it's my understanding that here in Minnesota, under the Data Practices Act, that when a governmental entity outsources an action that the government was doing, but they outsource it to somebody else to do it for them, that then that entity that's doing the outsourcing is subject to the Data Practices Act, and that you as an individual could put forth data practices requests to get the data you're looking for. Now, was there some complications in all of that?
You'd like to think so. What you've just described is the way it's supposed to work. It doesn't, in fact, work that way, and here's why. When you outsource things to vendors, you're absolutely right. There are court decisions that say if the government outsources its functions to vendors, the data that the vendors hold about those functions is treated the same as if it was governmental data. But that doesn't happen here because the Data Practices Act says that an exception is made for trade secret information. And of course, our HMOs say that what they did with the billions of dollars that we give them each year is a trade secret. Now, in addition to being a ridiculous assertion, what's more ridiculous is our State Department of Human Services agrees with that and says, yes, we gave them the billions of dollars and what they do with it is a trade secret. Now, that should enrage people to the point where that alone should be enough to call for the cessation of this insane outsourcing.
Right.
But that is the answer to your excellent question. There is no data because we treat what they do with our money as a trade secret, and you can't do that.
And what I find about that answer is there is this, and I see this oftentimes, certainly at the municipal government level, and I'm sure it's the same at the county level and state level, maybe even federal, is that there's a particular position that the entity wants to have, and of course, you know, lawyers were to be advocates for our clients to come up with the best argument to support what it is our client wants to say. In this case, you're saying that the HMOs, their position is they want to say it's trade secrets, and so their attorneys, well, rightly so, have come up with the best argument for saying it's a trade secret. But then somebody has to be fighting for the citizens to say, no, we have a different legal argument to say why your legal argument is not correct. So it sounds like the state of Minnesota isn't necessarily taking that position to say, we disagree with you.
The state of Minnesota, oddly enough, and in particular the Department of Human Services, absolutely does not take that position. They don't want to know. What we have in Minnesota is a don't ask, don't tell policy. And this is also extremely alarming because if there was any trade secret involved, it certainly wouldn't get to the level of payment data, which is a very simple question of the money that the state gave you to use for medical care. How much did you spend on medical care? How much did you pay yourself for administration? How much did you pay yourself for profit? How much did you keep for yourself? It's a very simple, straightforward question. We give you $4 billion. What did you keep for yourself and what did you spend on the intended purpose? Not a hard question to understand.
And they could do that in a pie chart.
They could do that a million ways. The striking thing is we have no payment information, none. The contracts that our Department of Human Services signed with these HMO vendors says that if they were asked for this data, they would have to provide it. The state, one, never asked them, and two, when pressed about it, the state, the Department of Human Services as well, we asked them, but they told us that they didn't want to provide it, so we said, okay. And that is such malfeasance, misfeasance, and nonfeasance that it boggles the mind. That is wrong in so many ways, we wouldn't have enough time to talk about all the ways it's wrong in an hour program. But clearly, they can't do that, but we are doing it. In Minnesota, we can't calculate a medical loss ratio. We can't talk about how much money was spent on care. What has happened as a result of all of this, we outsource these programs, ironically enough, because the argument was when you outsource these programs to these HMOs, you will get budget certainty. And that argument is correct. We have budget certainty. We know for sure that year after year, our costs have increased radically.
And they will spend the entire budget.
And they will spend the entire budget, but we don't know on what, and we don't know what the cost increases are attributable to because we don't have any paid claims data. It's sort of like if you gave somebody a $100 bill and said, go get me a gallon of milk, and they came back with a gallon of water and no change. And you said, what happened? And they told you, it's a trade secret. Now, you know, none of us would tolerate that, but when it comes to something as complex as a Medicaid program, we've been doing that for 20 years. So we have a very serious problem here. recently, about a year ago, I had the privilege of testifying before Congress. There were hearings held in Washington, D.C. about this because in 2011, a very interesting thing occurred. One of our HMOs, UCare, gave the state of Minnesota back $30 million. And this was unprecedented because, number one, I'm sure everybody watching understands, insurance companies don't just give anybody $30 million. It's impossible to get money out of an insurance company when they owe it to you. It's seldom that they show up and say, hey, here's an extra $30 million we had laying around. We don't need it. Why don't you take it? Well, that happened with the state of Minnesota. Naturally, some people wanted to know why, what was going on.
And why weren't the other HMOs doing the same thing?
Why weren't the other HMOs doing the same thing? What motivated it? What was happening? The company that gave it back, UCare, distributed a letter to about a dozen legislators, key people on the key Health and Human Services committees. And the letter said, we're giving you back this money because we've been losing money on a program called General Assistance Medical Care, and those losses have been subsidized or propped up with an inflated Medicaid rate. Now, that's illegal. You can't do that. But the letter also said that when the program that was being subsidized was eliminated by then Governor Pawlenty, the Medicaid rate wasn't lowered, and I'm quoting now, to reflect this overpayment. And so here's $30 million. Well, for those of us who were watching this and involved in it, this was pretty upsetting because we began to ask legislators some straightforward questions. One, how could these kinds of overpayments occur? Two, why did nobody notice that they had occurred? Three, how can you get back $30 million from the smallest HMO and not ask if anybody else owes you money? And four, what mechanisms are you going to put in place to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen in the future and figure out what was going on that motivated this and that caused this? And of course, this ran into a brick wall. Everybody just sort of whistled a happy tune. It's as if no one wanted to know because this was a difficult situation. Now, congressional leaders in Washington, they wanted to know. And so I was invited to Washington. Our DHS Commissioner, Lucinda Jessen, was invited to Washington. And a rather tense hearing was held where they said, what happened to this $30 million? How did it come that you got it back? And by the way, where's our half? Because the program is half funded by the federal government. If somebody gave you back $30 million, by definition, you owe the federal government half that. Well, there were some interesting questions asked, and long story short, at the end of the day, we gave them back $15 million. But clearly, it piqued their interest, and they began looking at Minnesota. Because of the inquiry that occurred, the current administration ordered that an audit should be done. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, as ridiculous as it sounds, there's never been an audit of these programs.
Really?
There has never been an audit of these programs. The HMOs are fond of telling people, we're audited by the Commerce Department all day long. There's auditors and HMOs every day of the year. That's true for their business of insurance. But this is not the business of insurance. This is the management of the public Medicaid program and related programs. There are no audits for this.
And also with audits, depending upon what the question is about, you can craft your audit to focus on particular key aspects of the books.
Absolutely. Anybody who's filed a tax return understands that there is a certain amount of juggling that takes place, and if it's done right, some of it is perfectly legal. You're allowed to deduct your business expenses. Let me give you an example. It is perfectly fine to say that you use your cell phone for business, or half of your cell phone bill is attributable to your business, and deduct that to lower your federal tax obligation. What you can't do is deduct 100 cell phones you don't even own. And so someplace between those two examples would be the line between appropriate maximization and unlawful conduct. Our programs had never been audited, so Governor Dayton instructed Commissioner Jessen to hire a forensic auditing firm, actuary firm, to come in and look at our programs. Along the way, The Commerce Department acknowledged that they had never audited these.
And a forensic audit, if I'm not mistaken, that actually looks at the processes as well, correct?
Absolutely.
It's not just determining whether or not if your balance sheet balances out, because in some audits, the purpose is just to see, does everything balance?
Exactly.
And then there's other audits, as you mentioned, a forensic audit, where they're looking at not only the bottom line, but also those processes and how did you get to the bottom line? Because as you mentioned, you can move a lot of money around and it can be this shell game. But if you're not focusing on the processes, as you mentioned, maybe one program was being propped up illegally by the funds from a different program, and you can't do that.
Absolutely. Going back to my tax return analogy, one type of audit activity would involve adding up the numbers in the columns to see if the totals are correct. And that is the most superficial of all audits. A real audit involves looking at the numbers that have been written in the columns to see if they're true, if they're accurate, if they in fact occurred, if there's any data to back them up, or they're just a fiction created for the purpose of doing the document. And that's the kind of audit that was needed. That audit's never occurred before. Commerce Department never did it. The Health Department acknowledges that they rely on the Commerce Department. So imagine our shock when the Health Department says, well, we rely on Commerce for these activities these many years, and Commerce said, we've actually never done this because we focus on insurance, and this is not insurance. This is the administration as a third-party beneficiary administrator of these programs. We don't really audit this. So they hired an auditing firm, the Siegel firm, a very well-respected national firm that does exactly this kind of thing, to come in and do an audit. And many people expressed concern about this because they were going to audit from 2003 to 2011. It's an 8-year period, and there was a very short time frame set for this. And people were worried, how are you going to audit this much data, over these many years in just a few months' time? Our legislative auditor expressed concern. Those of us involved in the process were a little bit concerned. Well, as it turned out, they managed to accomplish the task because, as it turns out, it's real easy to conduct that audit if there's no data. If there's no books and nothing to audit, you can audit pretty fast.
Interesting. Now, we have a caller on the line, so let's see what our caller has to say, and then we'll come back to that thought about there being no data. Now, caller, thank you for waiting. Questions or comments for us this evening?
Longrie, thank you for this show, and I want to thank this guest.
We need to get the sound out here. Thank you.
Thank you for this show.
Thank you.
I mean, this health, and thank you for this guest, the amount of energy you've put in this issue, because it doesn't seem like many people really care, and yet this is one of the biggest crises in this country. The scams and the ripoff that are going through these health insurance companies in countless number of ways. First question I have, of course, the one question is, why has there not been an audit? Because they audit everything in the state down to every penny. And for explanation, and why would they let this thing, which everybody acknowledges to be just a major crisis, just go scot-free? And then the other question I got is this question of that C-SPAN. When you guys went out to the U.S. Congress to testify, can we watch the previous video on the internet of what was going on there? Because this just opens up a whole variety of questions. And by the way, who on the Minnesota delegation is fighting for this transparency and accountability? I mean, is Representative Ellison or McCollum or Franken or Klobuchar, or are all these people too busy to stand behind you? Who are the real heroes out in Washington that we should be looking to for leadership and who are doing their job? Thanks for your help.
Okay. Thank you for those questions. Well, I know that you talked a little bit about the audit, and that this type of audit hadn't been done properly. Is there anything more to add to that, what you've added already?
Yeah, absolutely. This type of audit, which had never been done before, was amazing. And the reason it had never been done, because you'd expect the state to do it, the state had outsourced everything to the health plans, to the HMOs, everything. So when they lost control of the program, they really couldn't afford to start answering questions because they were reluctant to admit that they'd lost control of the program.
Plus, they had no funding associated with it to do that oversight, correct?
They had no funding to do the oversight, although the audit wasn't that expensive. In the overall Minnesota, state budget, and especially in the DHS budget, the cost of the audit is a rounding error. It's a very small amount of money. I believe that the state ultimately paid the auditors who did this $150,000, which to the average person certainly is a large amount of money, but in terms of administration of the state's budget, it is a rounding error. It's nothing. Not when you're talking about the expenditure of billions of dollars of tax money. So for the first time ever, we had these auditors come in and they looked at this and they discovered that there's no books kept. And they discovered that Minnesota had no claims paid data. In other words, Minnesota didn't know what the money was paid for, to whom the money was paid, whether or not the money went to the intended purpose. And Minnesota is unique in this. No other state is devoid of this information. It is a startling revelation, and one which Minnesota as a healthcare leader arguably, would find shocking. Also, one of the interesting brain teasers about Minnesota is Minnesota historically has the lowest Medicare costs in the country. Our providers are very efficient. They're not paid a great deal of money compared to other states. We have the lowest Medicare costs in the country. We have among the highest Medicaid costs in the country. Now, of course, Medicaid is a program that receives a federal match. We get federal matching dollars. And so many people would immediately think, well, what's wrong with that? We're just maximizing the federal component, the federal participation. That's what governmental people like to say. What difference does it make? It's just a little federal tax money. Well, it's all of our federal tax money. We're all paying that tab. Secondly, without this data, we're at a loss to understand if these programs are being run correctly, let alone honestly. And in addition, we're deprived of this essential information, which would be hugely valuable in such debates as healthcare reform, the effectiveness of various kinds of healthcare, and a whole variety of subjects which people have a real hunger for this kind of data, but there's nothing available to show them. So these auditors went to work and they looked at this, and the one thing we did discover is this. Our GAMC, or General Assistance Medical Care Program, which was a terrible program, poorly funded, operated at a guaranteed loss. Every provider in the state lost on it, and they lost big. But every provider in the state loses on the Medicaid program too. They lose individually, they lose in the aggregate. Lo and behold, our HMOs make money in the aggregate. They lose on the state-only funded programs, but they have a Medicaid rate that's high enough to make them whole in the aggregate. Well, some people might say, what's wrong with that? It does appear that our HMOs are setting the Medicaid rate. They're the ones who are telling the federal government how much money is needed to fund Medicaid. And they seem to, in the aggregate, do fine. Now, some people have characterized...
It almost sounds like skimming off some money out of the program, especially if you're the one setting what the rates are going to be, knowing that that is the rate that's going to make you whole in the end.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the question becomes then, well, maybe it's just a Robin Hood strategy. Maybe we just took a little extra money from the rich federal government to provide money for these poor state-only funded programs. But the money never seemed to find its way to the providers or the state-only funded programs. So if you steal from the rich and give to the poor, maybe you're Robin Hood. And by the way, it's still illegal. But what if you steal from the rich and keep it? Then what are you?
A thief.
That would be the answer most people would give to that question.
Yes. Now I understand we have another caller on the line with a question or a comment. Let's find out which it is.
Well, I'd like to know which one it is, too, because what I'm going to ask is that if I have a claim for an insurance company and I signed a thing, and that's punishable by legal action if I defraud anybody. Now, what happens when the insurance company does the reverse? Now, I'd like to know why they're not being punished or taken care of by legal way. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. which of course piggybacks on the whole idea about if you are stealing from the rich and then you keep it, and I would say you're even stealing from the poor and keeping it. What are you? You're a thief. So what are the legal consequences of this?
Well, first of all, in my estimation, and I believe other legal people will agree, and you can judge for yourself, what has been going on in Minnesota is in fact unlawful. It violates Title 19 of the Social Security Act. It also violates, going directly to the caller's question, something called the Federal False Claims Act. Interestingly enough, our Department of Human Services received a legal opinion in the middle of the U-Care debacle from a couple of their own lawyers, internal lawyers, because the question arose, should we give the federal government back $15 million or should we just try to keep the whole thing? And the advice was, try to keep the whole thing. And part of that advice was the opinion, look, these laws don't really apply to the state agencies, or the state employees. So the worst that can happen is if you get caught, you'll have to give back the money, so why not try to keep the money?
I see, because maybe it has something to do with sovereign immunity, and that they're doing it in the course of their duties?
Well, I'm not so sure that legal opinion is correct. I think the laws do apply, and I think that the federal government is becoming aware of what's been going on. Minnesota has been perhaps more brazen, or the most brazen, but Minnesota is not the only state that's engaged in these kinds of unusual activities. Recently in the state of New York, it was discovered that in state-operated facilities for the developmentally disabled, New York had been billing the federal government $5,000 a day for these services, which other states only charge $200 a day for.
That's quite a markup.
It's quite a markup. And again, the notion was, well, it's one unit of government cheating another. So really, what are you going to do? The fascinating thing in Minnesota is we've outsourced it, and it's no longer a unit of government. It's private corporate vendors. So what are you going to do? Well, I have several suggestions, and I believe that after the congressional hearings of last year and after this audit, and most importantly, if people who watch this program and have an interest in this, our callers and others, begin to write letters and demand that elected officials do something, and demand an accounting, demand a reckoning, and demand that somebody be held accountable, maybe we'll get someplace.
You know, and that goes back to the first caller's question number 2 and 3. If our viewers want to watch the hearings that you referenced there in Washington, D.C., I'm assuming that they can go to C-SPAN to do that, but give them some dates so they can try to find it.
Here's what you need to do. You need to just go to your computer and you need to Google Government Oversight and Reform Committee, April 25, 2012. Government Oversight and Reform Committee, April 25, 2012, will take you right to that hearing. Okay? It was a hearing that lasted for several hours, and if you have an interest in this, I think you'll find it eye-opening. Also, going to the caller's question in terms of the delegation, our congressional delegation, the only person thus far who has expressed serious interest in this issue is Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, who is a tax attorney by training and understands the issue. Everybody else seems to be less than thrilled about looking into this because of the political fallout ramifications. This kind of activity doesn't go on without some people understanding what's happening.
Right, I agree with you. It's not the kind of activity that just happens without people knowing about it. And from my perspective, I would think that there would be champions in both parties who are looking for accountability, because after all, this isn't necessarily a partisan issue on how taxpayer dollars are spent for accountability. I mean, if a corporation is skimming money out of programs that are to help disadvantaged people, I mean, that should be something that everybody is concerned about.
When you have corporate entities that have this kind of money, this multi-billion-dollar a year kind of cash flow, They spend money, money buys influence. It creates a very difficult situation. But yes, there are legislative champions, and oddly enough, when you look at them, they are as polar opposite as you can get. In the Senate, we have Senator John Marty, a stalwart progressive, known by his reputation as a champion of single-payer health care. When you look up progressive in the dictionary, his picture's in the margin. Everybody knows that John Marty is to the left of center. Wonderful gentleman, known him for years. On the flip side of the coin, we have Senator Sean Nenow. Sean Nenow is a Republican senator. He is anti-Affordable Care Act, or some people call it Obamacare. He is a fiscal conservative, and these people have political views which are as different as night and day. You couldn't find people who are more different than these two gentlemen, and what unites them is they find it intolerable that we don't know where the money went. They find it intolerable that we can't account or explain for this, and while each of them has a different perspective on what should be done with the money or what should have been done with the money, they both agree that it's critically important to find out what happened to the money and, if possible, get it back.
And if you do not know what happened to the money or how it was spent, you can't analyze the processes either, which goes back to something you said earlier, is that it's hard to know if the program is even working if you know nothing about how the money was spent and be able to measure then the outcomes and do any kind of benchmarking in the least bit. And we don't even have a pie chart.
Yeah. Well, here's what's interesting. The auditors reached a number of conclusions, which were published in their report. And the report is a fairly detailed report. It's over 113 pages. But the first 30 or 40 pages are the meat of it. And, it's the kind of thing that you would need to be fairly motivated to read. So let me give you, if I might, what I would consider some of the highlights. Number one, the auditors said that all the information that we give the federal government about this program comes from the HMOs. The HMOs are the source of all information. It's all self-reported. The auditors said that intuitively and intellectually, it seems unwise to rely on how much money you need to run a program from the people who profit from the operation of the program. There would be a better way to assess what the budget should be other than to ask the people who are making the money and keeping the money how much they think it should cost. Secondly, the auditors said it seems unreasonable that for these many years, no one would notice how out of whack the numbers are in this program. Minnesota has been representing to the federal government that we have an inflationary increase in our health care costs of between 8 and 9% a year. Yet when you look at physicians and other providers, they've not seen a penny increase for more than 12 years. Where did the money go? How do you conclude that there's a 9% increase when nobody's had a pay raise? More importantly, how could you conclude that there was a 9% increase when the national averages for increases run between 2 and 4% in states very similar or even larger than Minnesota? The numbers don't make any sense, and they're all self-reported numbers. Next, you have the issue that our contracts specify a level of profit or margin for these plans running these programs. They were supposed to make a percent. Now, while a percent, people might be tempted to say, what's a percent? A percent is nothing. What's a percent of $4 billion or $8 billion? It's a lot of money. It's more money than any of us will make in 10 lifetimes. It's an enormous amount of money. What the auditors found is that our managers of this program, our HMOs, missed the mark on the profitability. They didn't, since they represented how much they needed, they didn't take a percent, they took 2%. They were off by 100% in their profit. They have overbilled the government a minimum, according to the auditors, a minimum of over $200 million.
And because there was no accountability in how the money was being spent. Nobody could backstep and say this needs to be adjusted. This percentage is out of whack. It is incorrect. And this idea about self-reporting, again, when you're looking at good accounting principles, oftentimes in audits, if they look at the processes, like say even for nonprofit organizations that they have one person in charge of the checkbook, the treasurer, for instance, they may require that that person not be the only person to sign the check, so that you have some checks and balances going on. And so when you're talking about the self-reporting, in my mind, it brings me back to some of these basic principles to ensure that there's not misuse of the program by either individuals or the entity, because nobody else is there to watch the hens in the hen house.
Absolutely. Going back to my income tax analogy, which I am fond of, most people understand if they've ever received an audit from the IRS. The IRS wants to see your canceled checks. They want to see your credit card receipts. They want to see phone bills. They want to see evidence and itemization of payment made, what it was made for, and examine the appropriateness of whether those things and have what relationship to your tax liability and how you calculated and what you did. That's what an audit involves. If the HMOs were being audited, they, in the past, have simply done nothing more than give you another copy of their tax return and say, add up the numbers and see that the totals are correct. That's not an audit. That's ridiculous. So we finally understood now what's been going on, and people are outraged. As we dig into this, and as the auditors we hired, even without books to look at, they looked at the trend analysis and they looked at the numbers, they simply said, it's unreasonable, it's impossible, somebody had to notice this. And of course, that brings us to a question. You held up the City Pages article earlier. In that article, a man is quoted, a man named Christopher Dennis, who is a special agent in charge of healthcare fraud prevention and enforcement. These are people who investigate this kind of thing criminally. And Mr. Dennis had an interesting quote. He said, "That's the bread and butter of the fraudster, the fact that he can pay somebody to participate in the scheme," says Dennis. If you have a willing participant, you can eliminate the ability to tie the fraud to you. That person is going to lie for you because they conspired with you. So the question we now have to confront is, what if the willing participant in what appears to be an enormous Medicaid fraud against the federal government is our state agency? And what if the payment was the fact that they wouldn't have to fully fund state-only operated programs? Now, again, this is exacerbated by the fact that what if the extra money taken to plug the shortfall in these programs never made it where it was supposed to go? What if it sort of ended up in the HMO bank accounts, in their reserves? Because in recent years we've seen that HMO reserves are massive. They're huge. There's no explanation. Where'd the money come from? It's kind of like the UCare give back. How did this happen? No explanation. We need an explanation.
Many of our viewers probably, you know, when they're hearing about the HMOs, they're thinking, but aren't HMOs, aren't they nonprofits? And yet really that's part of that misconception, because just because something might be, a company might be organized as a nonprofit, that doesn't mean that they don't have stashes of reserves in their bank account, correct?
If an organization is nonprofit, it doesn't mean they don't make a profit. It means that there's no shareholders collecting dividends. Nonprofit corporate status confers tax exemption, not sainthood. And the problem with this is tax exemption is what all of us should be angry about. Because you see, when they don't pay taxes, we all pay more. When they don't pay sales tax, when they don't pay income tax, when they don't pay property tax, we all pay more. So we are absolutely entitled to see where the money goes. Furthermore, they do amass profits, and handsome profits. These organizations took 100% too much profit running these programs. Now, they didn't pay shareholders, but they have some interesting bonus programs for their employees. They have some interesting executive compensation structures. Some of them give away quite a bit of money, and giving away money to other organizations is a wonderful thing, but when you're giving away my money, I prefer to make my own charitable donations.
And especially when that money was intended for some other purpose.
Absolutely.
It wasn't intended to be a charitable donation fund for them to decide where it goes.
Yep.
It was already designated by legislation as to where it was to go and to who's to benefit from that money.
Exactly. In a sense, if you think about it, nonprofit corporate status is the perfect cover because nobody ever looks at them. Okay, everybody says, well, they're nonprofits. What difference does it make? You know, why would they do anything? What could they do with the money? Well, they can take the money, they can keep the money, they can spend the money, they can invest the money in the stock market, they can buy real estate holdings with the money, they can set up subsidiary corporations, some of which are for profit, and funnel the money there. All of this would be legitimate areas of inquiry for the taxpayers to demand because the money we're talking about is our money. They didn't get this money from anybody but us. From you, from me, and from everybody watching this program. That's where the money came from.
And if the state of Minnesota was looking for some entity to do this outsourcing, for instance, because the nonprofit HMOs have the corner on the market, so to speak, I would think that it would be very difficult for for-profit companies to say, well, we could do a better job of managing because they can't compete because they have to pay all those taxes and all those other various things that you mentioned that the nonprofit doesn't have to pay. And so there isn't any competition then, even for the contract.
Not only is that absolutely accurate, but if you factor in this Medicaid issue with the federal government essentially being like a broken ATM or a cash machine, if our 4 HMOs can tap this cash machine on the side a couple of times and it spits out money, who can compete with that? How are you going to come in and compete with that if you're not doing it too? And of course, who would know that you were doing it until now?
And who inside the whole scheme is going to be the whistleblower to open it up?
Well, I will tell you from personal experience, you know, there's no upside in doing it, but it needed to be done. It desperately needs to be done. Someone has to say, it doesn't make sense, it doesn't add up, we need to look at it. And, you know, people will say, oh, it's ridiculous, but we're past all the arguments now. We've learned in the last 2.5 years that the argument that these programs are continuously and routinely audited is not true. We've learned that the state has all this data and there's nothing to worry about. It's not true. Now the argument is, well, let's let bygones be bygones. This is an issue for the past. Going forward, we're making changes. Minnesota has heralded the fact that we have put these programs out for competitive bidding. Okay, our commissioner and under the current administration has said, for the first time ever, we've put this program out for competitive bidding. Let me tell you about our competitive bidding process. We started with 4 HMOs. We put the program out for competitive bidding. And after the dust settled, the winners of the competitive bidding process were the 4 HMOs. Okay? And what's really interesting is 2 of the HMOs were declared to be better than the other 2. And the 2 who were not so good, they were given the biggest counties in the state. Ramsey, Dakota, and Hennepin. Which leaves you to scratch your head and say, why on earth would anyone do this? Well, if you're involved in a scheme to leverage additional federal money that you're not entitled to, that would be one explanation. Perhaps there's another, we haven't heard it yet.
Now, our citizens out there, our viewers, they might be thinking, okay, so what can they do? I mean, they're just regular citizens out there listening to this program, and they have this feeling they need to do something. You said they should get a hold of their legislators. Give them some of those tips again on what they can do.
Here's the thing. You're going to call your legislator, and now I was, and I guess I still am, although I'm not paid for it and I have no clients, but I've been a lobbyist for over 3 decades. let me give you the responses that you're going to encounter. If you call your legislator and they're not a member of the Health and Human Services Committee, they're going to say, well, I'm not on that committee and there's nothing I can do. That's baloney. There's plenty they can do. They can make demands, they can put pressure on the governor, they can make speeches on the floor of the House or the Senate. There's plenty they can do. Don't accept that as an answer. You can also call your elected people in Washington. You can call your senators. You can call your representatives. And you can say, why aren't you doing something about this? Why does it even appear that you're not interested, even remotely, in this issue? Why aren't you involved in this? Why aren't you demanding that something be done? Because they don't have that excuse. They should be all over this. Is it because they're concerned about members of their own party or other people who might be implicated in this? I'm sorry, that doesn't work. We need to find out what's going on here. So you need to make those phone calls, you need to send those emails, you need to write those letters, and you don't take no for an answer. And you don't take the brush off that, well, it's complicated and you don't understand. You should acknowledge, that's absolutely right. I'm paying for this and I don't understand. And that, in fact, is the problem.
Or the explanation of, well, we're working on it, we'll get back to you.
Exactly.
That's also one of those statements that you might hear, that if you hear it, don't accept that statement either.
Yep, that is exactly right. In December of 2010, an email was sent from the trade organization that represents the HMOs to the Commissioner of Human Services about a week or two before she became the Commissioner of Human Services. And that email is disturbing. It contains the wording, it talks about what we're talking about here tonight. It talks about my efforts to obtain some kind of transparency and accountability. And the email says to the person who would become the commissioner shortly, I'm concerned that this not get traction within the Dayton camp without a chance to discuss the real facts involved in this story. Now, the problem is, I would love to hear the real facts involved in this story. Everyone watching this program would love to hear the real facts involved in this story. And the fascinating thing is, in the 2.5 years since this email was authored, we have the Siegel firm who have given us an audit which appear to tell us the real facts involved in this story. That these plans self-report their own data, that the plans have taken 100% over target and put it in their own pocket, that it's unreasonable that no one would pay attention to this, that Minnesota appears to be the only state in the union doing it this way. These appear to be the real facts involved in the story. And that we appear to be subsidizing illegally programs with additional federal funding, which seems to be getting stuck at the management level of this outsourced activity. So I think we'd all like to hear about the real facts involved in this story, and it's high time.
And that tone of that email, it sounds like they're trying to position themselves in order to talk to the Dayton camp to get their buy-in, so that way they are in on it and give it their blessing as well. And I agree with you. The citizens have to be upset about this and have to say, we need that transparency and accountability.
Yeah, the conventional argument at the Capitol is, well, we can't look into this. We don't want to, don't ask, don't tell. We don't want to know. We'll lose federal funding. What federal funding are we going to lose? The part we inappropriately took? And by the way, we don't have it. They have it. The vendors have it.
Right, and wouldn't it be better to understand what is going wrong and get it corrected rather than let it go too far? And, I mean, because that can't make Minnesota look credible in the, with the federal people who are looking at this. It doesn't make Minnesota look very credible if they're not actually trying to find out what is happening to that money.
Not only would it go a long way towards enhancing or even establishing at this point Minnesota's credibility, because Minnesota's halo is pretty tarnished given all of the occurrences in the last year. It is essential in order to have any meaningful modification of our healthcare system, in order to have any understanding. Let me give you an example I hope people will understand. For those people who have a health savings account, One of the big mysteries in life is, what does something cost? If I need an MRI, what does an MRI really cost? You know, does it really cost the $3,000 I'm quoted if I don't have insurance? Or if I have a high deductible HSA where I'm responsible for the first $6,000 or $8,000, does it really cost $3,000? I would like to know as a citizen, what does the Medicaid program pay for that? That would be handy information for me to have. So I could say to the provider, well, I understand you'd like to charge me $3,000, but when you do it for somebody on Medicaid, you take $400 as payment in full. You know, I'd like to pay that price too. We don't know that because we don't have any claims paid data. And that information would be extremely useful to all the people who work and fund HSAs and need to know that kind of thing. And of course, we don't have any of it. So that's just a common everyday example of the kind of information we're lacking that hits each of us in the pocketbook, because we are flying blind when it comes to health care. We don't know how it works, we don't know what it costs, and again, I'm not talking about getting involved in private insurance. Private insurance is private insurance. When the state spends taxpayer money for these activities, it's not private insurance. It's state public programs, and as taxpayers, we are entitled to know where every penny went.
And as a consequence also of not having the proper data and the accountability for the money that's being spent and how it's being spent, future budgeting, whether or not if it's at the state level or the federal level, is suspect, because it's being based upon numbers that have no backing. And then other budgets may have a consequence because maybe you've taken too much or too little. And how can you properly budget if you don't have the real data?
Well, again, an excellent point. And one of the fascinating things about this problem is, in a sense, we've allowed these vendors to annuitize this fraud, because the inflated trend forward projections are built into the base calculations now. It's sort of the gift that keeps on giving, or the fraud that keeps on defrauding. Going forward, all the future payments are based on inflated numbers. Even if you recovered some of the money, what you'd need to do is you'd need to go and deconstruct the rate calculations to remove the falsely submitted component to calculate the real costs, because we're footing the bill for this.
So even the assumptions are flawed.
Exactly.
Now, we're down to our last minute, and I want to make sure to let our viewers know that if they're interested in maybe reading a little bit more about this, there is a study that they can read, a summary that's called Who's Minding the Store? And this is research and prepared by the Greater Minnesota Healthcare Coalition, and they are in Mora, Minnesota. So I'm sure you could Google this, who was minding the store, and that way then you can find where you can get this report. And in our last minute, David, any other last summaries you would like to give our viewers?
Only that I cannot encourage you enough to call, to write, to email. Don't take no for an answer, and keep hammering on it. It's your health care costs that are being impacted here. It's your access to health care. It's the infrastructure of the provider network that's now crumbling around our ears that we're talking about. This is not an esoteric or a theoretical problem for people. This is our problem in terms of our health care system. And given that the Affordable Care Act largely involves the expansion of this program, if this program is flawed or corrupt, this is a problem we must address, or it will be fatal to the future of our healthcare system.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a huge takeaway for our viewers, is that because the Affordable Health Care Act is looking to really expand on this program, if you have a program that's flawed, if its assumptions are flawed, if the data is flawed, then your expansion is going to be greatly flawed.
Exactly. And now we have a professional, nationally recognized audit firm that says essentially all of this. So it's no longer conjecture. Now the question is, what's going to happen?
That's right. Well, I want to thank you, David, for coming on the program. It's been very informative. And maybe you can come back again some other time and give us a follow-up.
I'd be delighted. Thank you.
And to our viewers out there, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Off the Record News. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.